Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hope everyone is well. Please feel free to move around a little bit if you need to make it easier to see or to not be like this the whole talk. So you may have noticed in the chanting this morning, after the chanting of the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani, we list names of people who have passed away from this world, and you'll notice that in the recitations this morning there was the name of Itabashi Koshu Zenji, and he was one of the teachers in Japan that was profoundly influential to me. Really shining example of the breadth of heart that emerges from deep practice. And he became the head of our school of Buddhism, which is the largest school in Japan. And he was beloved by thousands and thousands of people. He was a little bit of a rock star teacher, rock star Zen teacher. Like, he would go places to give talks, and hundreds and hundreds of people would come together to listen to him, speak. He never said anything very complicated. When I studied with him, he was at that point maybe in his teaching where all the complexity could just drop away, which I appreciated, and aspire to, although it may not seem that way if you're listening to my talks. Anyway, I feel a small tinge of sadness at his passing. He was 94 and had been sick for a long time. But more than the sadness, I just feel the deep gratitude to have met and studied with such a being, and look forward to our continual meetings in this and other worlds. So this morning I'd like to start talking about the freedom of wisdom. So over the past several months, I've been talking about the perfections, which is one of the oldest ways in which Buddhist teaching is talked about. The path of the Buddhist practice and awakening is talked about as this group of teachings called the Six Perfections. And I've been emphasizing in these talks how each of those perfections, or another way we talk about the perfection, is a crossing over. That each one of them is talking about freedom, is talking about liberation. Mukti or vimukti would be the name in Sanskrit. And my point here is to emphasize that we don't just wait for awakening to happen. We don't do things now simply for the purposes of later on them becoming better. But the way that we live now, the way that we act, the way we practice, the way we study, the way we are with each other, that those things in themselves are liberating. Not something to wait for, but something that is has a freedom inside of the practice itself. When we talk about liberation or we talk about freedom in Buddhism, we're talking about the release from the cyclic existence, release from the cycles of suffering or dis-ease which mark life. So first noble truth in Buddhism, the noble truth of suffering, which can sound a little bit negative, is just inviting us to recognize how much of our life is driven by these cycles of dis-ease. In the center, we have a kind of unsettledness, anxiousness. And because of that anxiousness, we make choices, sometimes conscious, most of the time not conscious, that form the life that we live. And that these cycles of suffering emerge from that. It doesn't mean everything's bad. It doesn't mean everything is suffering in the kind of general sense of suffering, like it's directly painful, but it means that those cycles enact themselves again and again, and the anxiousness doesn't go away. In fact, the anxiousness then becomes the center of gravity for how it is that we're living. So when we talk about liberation in Buddhism, we're talking about that. We're talking about how do we go beyond that cyclic life that kind of suffering that comes from putting anxiousness at the center and allowing anxiousness to be what drives the rest of life. So in that way of understanding, we say that at the center of all those cycles, there's one very important thing for us to become familiar with. And in Buddhist language, it's called ignorance or delusion. Avijja is the name in Sanskrit. I don't know how to pronounce Sanskrit very well, so that's my approximation of the Sanskrit pronunciation. In Japanese, is known as mumyo, or non-luminescence, without luminosity, is the way that's written in the characters. But ignorance doesn't just mean not knowing something, not knowing a piece of information. It has to do with a misseeing, a misconceiving, that we conceive of ourselves, we conceive of the world in a way that is skewed. Right? And it's skewed by self-grasping and other grasping. This is the foundational Buddhist teachings, that we grab on to the idea of a self, to the experience of a self, the idea and the experience of other, and in that process, this ignorance fuels the cycle of suffering. It's right at the center. It's the hub. Because we buy into the idea of a self and an other as being just fundamentally true. Buddhism doesn't say that there's no self and no other, right? It says that there's no permanently abiding self and other. There's no permanent selfness and no permanent otherness. Any experience we have of self and otherness is mutual. It arises together. The self and the non-self arise together, not independently. But ignorance is not being able to see in that way. We might even be able to understand that intellectually. I mean, it's wonderful, right? We have all kinds of teaching now about our interbeing, about how it is that we're so interconnected with each other and with this earth. I'm so happy that those teachings and perspectives on things are coming forward in really beautiful and sophisticated ways. But to just understand it does not eliminate ignorance, because ignorance has to do with the way that we see. So reorganizing our conscious way of seeing is part of it, but the ignorance lies deeper than that, would be a traditional Buddhist way of understanding. And that there is a Dharma medicine which responds to this dis-ease because it can respond to ignorance. It can help us overcome that fundamental grasping, right? Not just in an intellectual way, right? But within our being. Not just changing what it is that we see, but changing how we see the world. So this is why prajna, or wisdom, is so important within the Buddhist teachings. And that's what I'd like to talk about this morning, the freedom of wisdom. Within the Prajnaparamita Sutras, or teachings, which is the oldest and I would say the most celebrated body of teachings within Mahayana Buddhism, prajna, or wisdom, is seen as being the animating force of all of the other practices. So for example, if we're practicing meditation, that's really good. And we practice meditation to be able to find some spaciousness, to find some calmness, to practice mindfulness, to be aware of things. But as prajna enters, it starts to break down our fundamental ignorance about grasping after self and other. And so meditation isn't only about how do I feel, right? How am I experiencing things? But it's starting to take the medicine of letting go of how I feel as being the central question of meditation. Does that make sense? So we're turning from there just being the central question of meditation being how do I feel, to wow, the I-ness that feels some way is completely inseparable from the rest of the world. And so you can see how things like ethics arise from that. Because the way that I'm feeling under the current conditions have everything to do not just with the me-ness, but it has to do with everything that's not me. And so meditation takes on this other kind of life. It's animated by prajna. Okay? It's animated by a teaching which is encouraging us and showing us how to release this fundamental grasping after self and other. So the word prajna is usually translated as wisdom, which I don't know if that's a good translation, but it's what we have, so we use it. Other words that are in the same ballpark that are used sometimes, or you might think to kind of round out that word prajna, is understanding, insight, to see into things, to see into the nature of things. Okay. It has a little bit of a flavor of seeing correctly. And correctly here is a tricky word because we're so used to the word correct being like, Ejo told us this is how I'm supposed to see it. If I see it that way, therefore it is correct. That's not the kind of correct I'm talking about. I'm talking about a correct, in this case, means in alignment with the law. And in this case, the law means the Dharma. It means what the Buddha woke up to. The Buddha woke up to this fundamental facts of being. So are we seeing in accord with that or not? That's what correctly means in this case. Are we seeing the Dharma? That would be prajna. Prajna is seeing the Dharma, or seeing through the Dharma. Seeing the world through the eyes of the Buddha. That's a way we could understand what prajna is about. It's thought of as being the great wondrous medicine, or it's titled as the great wondrous medicine of Buddhist practice and awakening. It's fundamentally concerned with how do we conceive of things? How do we see the world? How do we see ourselves? It's thought to be, or it's taught to be, one of the three facets of practice. In the oldest ways that practice was described within Buddhism, the very, very early teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha that have continued up until today, we usually separate the path into three parts. One part is samadhi, or concentration, meditation, quality of our heart. Another is sila, which is usually translated as ethics. How do we act in the world? How do we speak? What do we do? What do we base our living on? And then the third facet is prajna, wisdom. How do we see the world? What is the fundamental building blocks of how it is that we experience? Now, in the conventional understanding of Buddha Dharma, there's very precise teachings that help us look at experience and try to understand what's happening through our experience. And so when we talk about prajna as a medicine, that's one level at which it's a medicine. And this is a very important medicine. We have been schooled, both in school, but just largely speaking through whatever kind of cultural dynamic that we grow up in, we've been taught a way to conceive the world, to think about what's important, what's not important, even to think about like what exists and doesn't exist, what counts as being alive or doesn't count as being alive, what counts to be called a person so that it can have free speech or not. Right? I mean, it gets political, right? I'm not trying to go to a political place, but I'm saying that that's not a set deal. That's changing all the time, right? Who gets to vote? Who doesn't get to vote? Those conceptions are moving around all the time, and they're moving around in big political ways, but they're moving around just moment to moment to moment. What do we pick out of this mass of light which is entering into our eyes at every moment that our eye is open? There's a mass of light entering in your eye right now. What do you pick out as worthy of your attention? This is an important question. What do you pick out as worthy of your attention? This has to do with a whole mass of ways of conceiving the world that move through you. You're conditioned to see the world in some way. So Buddhism says, okay, let's take up some of these teachings that come from this ancient tradition and let's mess with that a little bit. Let's let's jiggle the system and see where there are these tight spots that are causing us suffering. So for example, and I've said this over and over, if you conceive of another being as less than you, and that you have the right to impinge upon them to satisfy your greed, this will create suffering. It will create suffering for them, definitely, but it also will create suffering for you. This is a Buddhist teaching. That to live in that kind of power dynamic causes instability, it causes anxiousness, it causes pain. So we could argue with that, and it's good. You could say, well, okay, in what kind of situations? Or how do we eat, right? If I don't at least dominate a carrot, then how am I going to be, even survive? So there's all kinds of things we can work with that. It's not just a dogma that says, do it exactly this way, but it's a teaching that says, okay, you're completely interrelated with the rest of the world. How are you going to live? That helps us to reform the way we conceive of life by looking at the world in a different way. One of this, I think, beautiful teachings within Buddhism is to regard every being that you meet as, at one point, having been your mother. And further, at one point, you were their mother. Now, when you actually meet your mom, it gets confusing. It's like mirrors facing mirrors, But just to think about that, how does that change your way of thinking? If you say every being I meet is as if I'm meeting my mother. Every being I'm meeting, I'm their mother. Maybe the way you ask someone to wear a mask changes a little bit. The teachings that are most fundamental in this part of the teaching, I don't mean only the most important, but they exist in the most fundamental place, are the teachings of dependent origination, which in another way of thinking about it is the teachings of emptiness, which in another way of thinking about it is the teaching of no self and no permanence. So those are the central kind of reconstructive elements of this prajna. Usually emptiness is the one that gets put on the front burner. Okay, that's the one that you hear a lot. People will say, what are prajna teachings? If you just ask them, what's prajna teachings? Almost always you'll get back the answer, they're teachings about emptiness. Right? So emptiness is one way of talking about it. But emptiness is a part of a cluster of teachings, which is trying to get us to reimagine the world, to reimage the world. Dependent origination is one way of explaining emptiness. It says nothing exists independently. It exists dependently. It originates dependently. Whatever it is that we conceive, whatever phenomena, that phenomena will not have arisen just through whatever it is that I can see as the phenomena. So if I see a blade of grass, that blade of grass does not exist solely through the powers of that blade of grass. That blade of grass exists because of all the things that are not that blade of grass, which comes together for that blade of grass to be able to be present. That's the teaching of dependent origination, or that's one of the styles of teaching dependent origination. You see that? So emptiness there doesn't mean, the blade of grass is unimportant. It means if I see a blade of grass, I should also realize that I'm seeing everything showing up in that blade of grass. That kind of teaching. Now, when I'm focused on the blade of grass, it's pretty hard for me to think about the things that aren't the blade of grass. Okay? But what the Buddha Dharma is inviting us to do is say, please pay attention to the blade of grass, but regard the blade of grass not just as being this isolated phenomena, but being a blade of grass which is reflecting all these other things. If that's the case, the blade of grass doesn't get to be a permanent self. It's not just a permanent, independently existing blade of grass. Right? It's a blade of grass that's part of a whole system of rhizomes, right? A whole system of water and sun and lawnmowers and all kinds of different things. Maybe goats, if you're not in North American modern society. Maybe a system of goats is eating the grass. So everything is there. And these teachings tell us that the deeper that we understand that, not just intellectually, but in the way we see the world, this addresses suffering. The anxiety that we feel transforms when we start to live that way. And that transformation is central to the Buddhist project or Buddhist teaching. I had this experience a couple days ago. I was out of town for a couple days helping somebody who struggles with alcohol addiction, and I was calling the Serenity Lane, like the detox place, because their blood alcohol content was at a level where like they can die from the level of blood alcohol content that they had. So getting into a detox can be important. So I called the person. I made an appointment to have an interview. They're supposed to interview the person who's supposed to come into detox, but the person who's in detox is like so completely out of their skull that they can't really talk with someone on the phone. So it's one of those catch-22 situations. Not very much fun. But I had made this appointment for the following morning and got up the next morning, and it looked like we weren't going to need to go to detox. Things went through a pretty a good way. And so I called in the morning, and I was talking with the woman on the phone. I said, well, I made this appointment for 9:00, but we're not going to need it. And she said, oh, great. How are you handling this? And I explained to her what we were doing. She said, okay, that sounds good. She said, just know that we're always here if you need us. And something in my heart just burst open. I was like, wow, how much support it is to me, to this person, to the society, for her to be there at that phone, answering the phone and saying, how can we help you? And I said to her, I said, thank you. But not just like, oh, thank you for this, but like, thank you. And she said, oh, you're welcome. A little bit like confused about what I was saying. I was like, thank you for being there. It is such a support to my life and to this person and to their family to know that this is here, even if we're not using it right now. And she said, that's why we're here. That's why we're here. What would life be like if we put our mind on seeing that? If we put our mind on seeing what is the compassion with which people are enacting their life? Right? I'm not saying that she's perfect or Serenity Lane is perfect or anything. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying the way in which she is enacting her life through compassion. If I want to know about compassion, I have to learn to see compassion. To see it. Because when I could see it in her, the reason I could see it is because I knew that she wasn't living her life simply grasping onto her own self and to others. She was enacting something in which self and other were not, that distinction was not the primary motivating factor. And as I could see it, I knew that's how it can work in me. This is not complicated. To see the workings of compassion in the world, to put our mind on it, this is one of our accesses to prajna. One of the reasons I want to emphasize compassion is because one of the things when we try to apply medicine, so if we're applying prajna or wisdom to ignorance, that it's very easy for those two things to become opposed to each other. When the teachings, when prajna become opposed to ignorance and they stand in opposition, their ability to help carry us over to the other shore, their ability to help us wake up, their ability to relieve suffering, disappears. So if prajna stands in opposition to ignorance, it's no longer prajna. The oppositional mind itself is ignorance. So if we think about prajna as being like the truth, it being right, it being correct understanding, all those things that I've been saying, all those things that we might go through a process of trying to understand, once that becomes in opposition to ignorance, now we're stuck. We've touched the flypaper and we can't get it off. The strength of prajna is in its non-opposition. The strength of wisdom is that it doesn't divide the world in that way and try to hold them opposite. And this isn't just a kind of like fluffy teaching. This isn't a teaching that's like, well, if everybody just was nice to each other, everything would be okay. For any of you who have practiced martial arts, you will know this principle. Many years ago, I used to practice a few different martial arts, but one of them was Aikido. And in Aikido, you do a lot of sword work. So the very advanced people get like real sharp swords and like your ears get in danger and things like that. I was never at that point. We had the wooden swords. Really fun. But one of the principles of the wooden sword is if you're learning to make a cut. I remember that when I was in class one day and I was doing my cut and I thought I was being so great. And the teacher was like, what are you doing? You're just reacting to the other person's sword. You're fighting the other person's sword. You should be cutting all the way through them. That's how a sword works. It's not like, oh, I touched you, oh, I win. Oh, I touched you, I win. No, it's like, you have to cut all the way through. And if you watch those really amazing martial artists, the way that they move, the way that they punch, the way that they use a sword or the way they use a staff, is they're going all the way through. Their target isn't the chest of whoever it is that that attack is going at. Their target is some spot which is inconceivable. Sometimes a martial arts instructor will be like punch 2 feet behind the person. Okay, my point here is not that we should all go out and start fighting, but my point is that the strength that is manifested when we move past, we move through, rather than in this tit for tat kind of oppositional mind frame. That's what prajna is offering us. And oftentimes a sword is a symbol of wisdom. It's a symbol of prajna, that it cuts through, right? And it cuts through because it is completely and totally present. It's totally meeting what is there. If you only meet the face of what you see, like in the case of the martial arts metaphor, if you only meet what you think your enemy is, just the face of your enemy, you're just fighting a shadow. To completely meet your enemy is going to require your own opening. You don't know what your enemy is. You can't calculate all of the possibilities of what your opponent might bring forward. So you have to come into total presence with them. So this is the quality of medicine of prajna. The sword is really sharp. Right? The sword is really sharp because it meets totally what's there, not just our image of it. Now, one place of confusion, one place where a fundamental place where this setting apart or setting oppositionally happens is between what is conceived, what is it that I see, and the teaching that says whatever it is that you see is not totally real in the way you think of it. Right? In Buddhism, we call that form and emptiness. Okay? So form is like any phenomena that I see. And the teaching of emptiness says, yeah, you see that phenomena, that's one side of it, but it's not really what you think it is. The way you're grabbing onto it is limited. That's a teaching of emptiness. Emptiness comes from this image of like a bubble, blowing up a soap bubble, and the bubble's there, right? You can see the bubble, but actually there's nothing really there. I mean, there's a little thin membrane of soap. We could call that little thin membrane of soap as grasping mind. And that grasping mind gives you the sense that there's something inside the bubble and something outside of the bubble. Okay? So that's teaching of emptiness. So normally we hear emptiness, we're like, oh, if there's emptiness, then that means form has to go away. Form is meaningless. Right? Because emptiness is what Buddhism is teaching. So if we get to these central teachings of the Prajnaparamita, or the freedom of wisdom, what they come back to again and again and again is saying, no, form and emptiness are completely one thing. They're totally reconcilable. Emptiness does not destroy form. Form does not destroy emptiness. That those two come together. That what is negated in the teaching of emptiness is just your grasping after making that phenomena be permanent, making that phenomena be solid, making that phenomena, insisting on that phenomena being independently existing from you. And when you insist on that, it goes dark. The luminosity fades away. Possibility fades away. Illumination fades away. I was trying to make my talk shorter. It's not working very well, sorry. So I want to give you an example of why this is important. This comes from the holy teachings of Vimalakirti, which is a Mahayana sutra or teaching that focuses on wisdom in some very interesting ways. The Vimalakirti is a lay person who's a kind of a great person of this village, lives in a big mansion and everything. Anyway, the Buddha's he pretends to get sick, or it would be better to say he gets sick, actually gets sick, but he actually gets sick for the reason of teaching the Buddha's disciples. And the Buddha tells his disciples, oh, go see Vimalakirti. And the first part of the sutra, they're all like, no, I don't want to go see Vimalakirti. And the Buddha says, why? And then they recount these instances in which they met the Buddha, and they met Vimalakirti, and Vimalakirti messed up their understanding. Or he messed with their understanding of the Buddha Dharma, right? They're affixed to some view. And Vimalakirti is this sharp sword of wisdom. That's what he represents. And so he's always giving these teachings which are very, very sharp. And in one of the chapters of this, there is a wonderful exchange that happens between a goddess that is living in Vimalakirti's palace. And she's been living there for several years, about 12 years is what it says in the sutra. And she's having this dialogue with Shariputra, who is, this great hero of Buddhist teachings. He shows up in the Heart Sutra, which we chant on Sunday mornings. Right? And she's having this exchange with him about Buddha Dharma. And he asks her this question. He says, Goddess, what prevents you from transforming yourself out of your female state? Now let me say a couple of things about that. In patriarchal Buddhism, I'm not saying that that's something that's past. I'm saying that that's part of a stream within Buddhism. Is patriarchal consciousness is a big problem. And within that, there have been teachings that say that the only way that you can be enlightened is if you are in the body of a man. Now, very early on, this is the ancient sutra, people wanted to mess with that. They were like, what do you mean, man? Like, first of all, why would that be a thing? That a man could be enlightened, but a woman couldn't be enlightened. But then, what do you mean man? What do you mean woman? And so, Shariputra in this case is a representative of this kind of stuck understanding about practice. And his understanding would be, to be a man is better, because you could become a Buddha if you were in the body of a man. And he's having this conversation with his goddess, and she has all these supernatural powers, and she's super wise and super great. And so Shariputra's like, why are you still in the body of a woman? Why haven't you transformed? And the goddess says this. She says, although I have sought my female state for these 12 years, I have not yet found it. Reverend Sariputra, if a magician were to incarnate a woman by magic, would you ask her, what prevents you from transforming yourself out of your female state? So she says, I looked for my female state. I can't find it. Why do you see a female state? That's the implication, right? Why do you see me as female? I looked for those marks, which you call female. I don't see them. And then she further on goes, if there was a woman who was made by a magician, the image of the woman was made by a magician, would you say to her, why have you not transferred out of the state of being a woman? And Shariputra says, no, such a woman would not really exist. To what would there be to transform? And the goddess says, just so, Reverend Shariputra, all things do not really exist. Now would you think, what prevents one whose nature of that of a magical incarnation from transforming your... I'm going to have to bring my glasses, sorry guys. Now would you think, what prevents one whose nature is that of a magical incarnation from transforming herself out of her female state? So, if things don't really exist, they don't really exist in the way that I think they exist, independently as this solid phenomena, then why are you asking these questions about me being a woman or not being a woman? Why would transformation out of the womanly state be important if everything is arising through emptiness? Thereupon the goddess employed her magical power. I love this part of the sutra. She employs her magical power to cause the elder Shariputra to appear in her form and to cause herself to appear in his form. So she switches, right? She now becomes the form of Shariputra, and Shariputra becomes the form of the goddess. And then she asks him, Reverend Shariputra, what prevents you from transforming yourself out of your female state? And Shariputra, transformed into the goddess, replied, I no longer appear in the form of a male. My body has changed into the body of a woman. I do not know what to transform. The goddess continued, if the elder could again change out of the female state, then all women could also change out of their female states. All women appear in the form of a woman in just the same way as the elder appears in the form of a woman. While they are not women in reality, they appear in the form of women. With this in mind, the Buddha said, in all things there is neither male nor female. Okay? So up to this point, she's deconstructing this idea that there's an independently existing male and female. Right? She's calling all Shariputra's assumptions about that into question. She flips. Right? She flips. She said, oh, now you're a woman. Why don't you change? Right? And he's like, I don't even know what that would mean. I don't even know what that would mean. And they become unaffixed to the ideal of male and female. But that's not all. Okay? Because at this point, the medicine sounds like, let's discard gender. Let's get rid of the distinction between male and female, because it's not real. Okay? It's not independently, permanently real. Then the goddess released her magical power, and each returned to his ordinary form. She then said to him, Reverend Shariputra, what have you done with your female form? Shariputra says, I neither made it nor did I change it. And the goddess says, just so. All things are neither made nor changed, and that they are not made and not changed, that is the teaching of the Buddha. This is a very subtle point. That they are not made and that they do not change. This is the point. So if we hold emptiness in the opposition of form, we want to destroy gender, for example. So when Shariputra says, well, why don't you become a man? She doesn't say, well, it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. So shut up, Shariputra. She says, gender. This is an interesting dichotomy which you live in. Let's go through. Let's explore. What would it be like if I were you and you were me? But then she goes on to say, things are just as they are. I didn't fashion myself as a woman. No one fashioned me as a woman. I arose with perfect luminosity, just as I am. Why are you trying to push things around? This has deep implications for how we conceive of the world. That the luminosity that she's pointing to is about suchness. It's about how things are. to a mind that is embroiled in self and other grasping, it's just nonsense. How could things be exactly what they are and not be what I think they are at the same time? But ingesting the medicine of wisdom, actually that fact is pretty plain. When you encounter something with a real open heart and mind, with generosity of spirit, that thing doesn't get in the way of wholeness. The person on the other end of the phone, which is offering you help, they're representative of wholeness. And them existing or not existing in an independent way is not really the point. We have a little time for questions if anyone's roaring to go. It's just to say that last part that I read from Vimalakirti Sutra, if that was confusing to you, tune in to the next two talks. I will do my best to make it more confusing, but in a way, hopefully, that's illuminating in some way. This is the talk. This is the kind of quality of the talk of the Prajnaparamita teachings. So when you start to read them, almost always you start going, "Oh." We were talking about this at breakfast this morning. Is it just an invitation to, like, chase your tail, right? Or is there something actually in it that is illuminating? That can be a little bit hard to tell the difference until you get used to the way that the teachings around prajna work.
It seems like at play in those teachings, there's this dance of the provisional and the absolute.
Yeah. Why do you find that important?
Because both are part of life. It seems like our society tends to dwell and focus on the provisional. Like this is reality. This is the truth.
Yeah.
And we tend to get stuck there.
Yeah, I agree. You know, this has to do with this wisdom of cutting beyond what you see, is that because we grab on to what we think of as being things that are real in kind of a concrete sense, if we only see that side of it, we just get stuck in the karma of it. And like the possibility for something beyond starts to leak out of the situation. I mean, I think the situation we're in with COVID-19, for example, is a perfect example. If we really want to pay attention to what needs to happen, then we have to have a vision that goes beyond just how do we, what are we supposed to do this week according to the rules. Now, those rules are very important, don't get me wrong. We're doing our best to follow those here at the temple, and I am in my own personal life. But the point being that without the vision, right, to work for something that is beyond just managing the details of staying safe. I mean, first of all, what a lost opportunity. What a lost opportunity to say, do we notice all the other problems in our society that are being exposed by this? What kind of vision could we have that carries us beyond that? That's where I think that the stuck in the provisional becomes such a trap. And we don't, many religions or different kinds of faiths, they might emphasize a sort of story of the beyond. And Buddhism has that flavor in some places. But what really I think is so inspirational is to say it's not about something that's going to happen later. It's not about something that's going to happen after you die. Right? That right now there's a different world within the moment that you are experiencing. And the gateway to that world is to encounter the emptiness of those phenomena. When you encounter the emptiness of those phenomena, then a different world can shine through them. Maybe it's not a question.
Okay. Dukkha.
Ejo?
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about wisdom not in opposition to ignorance in the way that we relate to each other. It seems like American culture has gotten to a place where we're so oppositional we can't barely speak to each other. And it's something that I really see you manifest in the way that you talk to us and the way you answer our questions, is that you really have a way of leading us forward from a place of mutuality rather than, oh, you're incorrect, let me show you how you're correct, how to be correct. And how can we manifest that with each other?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the short answer I think is just what I'm talking about. It's wisdom. It's ingesting this medicine, and one thing that comes up in the Prajnaparamita teachings again and again and again is this idea of where does the Bodhisattva take their stand? Where do you take your stand? And in the Prajnaparamita literature, it says again and again that the Bodhisattva stands nowhere. The Bodhisattva realizes there is no place where you could stand that would be separate from all the other places. So you can't be in opposition. You can't carve out a place of safety in which you're going to defend in relationship to others. And I think we really could use that in our situation. It's the opposite of giving up. Actually, kind of going into your nest and fortifying it is much closer to giving up than saying, no, I want to meet you. I want to talk with you. I want to expose my own viewpoint as being provisional. Right? I actually want to be upended. Right? Because in that upendedness, I know freedom, as opposed to clutching on to the place that keeps me safe, because I have some provisional thing that I can really hold on to. In a political sense, I think it has to do with a deep regard for the wholeness. And this is where I believe that the deeper political work comes from. If we're talking about the division politically or socially, that if we are not able to cut into with real sincerity the positions that we find reprehensible, then no medicine can arrive there. No medicine can arrive in a place where that opposition is all there is. I taught a young woman in high school, when I was a high school teacher 6 or 7 years ago, a beautiful, beautiful soul. And she's very, very conservative Christian, and was within a congregation, was very, very politically conservative. And in the class that we were studying religion, and we studied ethics and different things, and she was a very, very strict vegetarian. And I had never met like a really conservative, politically conservative Christian who was also vegetarian. I had met some Seventh-day Adventists many are vegetarian, and so I had met that guy, but this was a different thing. And so I was talking with her one day, I was like, what's going on? And she said, oh, I'm ecologically, she was like a super ecological activist. She was like 15, and she had created this whole group within her church to focus on ecological issues. And she started telling me she's the leader of this group, she's like 15, right? And she started telling me this whole story about how the elders in her church were so suspicious of her and everything that she was bringing forward, but that the whole congregation was starting to shift, that they were starting to embrace ecological thinking. Now, when we got into some discussions about homosexuality, for example, she was totally on this point about how that's not okay, ordination of women, all those things. She lined up with these very, very conservative positions, but on this, she was very, not only open, but super insightful, and was doing real work. So the reason I bring that up is the medicine of people caring about our impact on the earth had reached her. And she hadn't taken up some stance in which she was just trying to you know, beat down the wall. She was actually doing the work of figuring out where we're stuck as a society. If she didn't do it there, nobody would. So I keep that in mind when I'm talking with people. I don't know if I'm right, and if medicine's going to spread around, we all have to let the walls down a little bit.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
It's Moxie. I've been working with a group of people around reforming policing, and I wondered how you can. Hello. I wonder how you can work, how a group can work with power structures that hurt them when it's painful for them in ways that it's not painful for every group. And what kind of, you talked about coming into full presence with the opposition, and I wondered how do you navigate pain and fear and real physical threat that's unique to your form, and get really through it and be able to transform the situation.
Yeah, I would say the short answer is you have to include it. What we think is that all that has to be put aside to be able to then do the work. But my experience is that it's just the opposite. That if you don't include that within what's on the table, then you can't get anywhere. So, for example, people who want to say that we need to put aside all of our feelings of rage to be able to then enter into an authentic conversation around oppression, I don't think they're getting it. That actually those experiences of rage have to be included. But our insistence that everybody conform to my idea of how they should be enraged or shouldn't be enraged is also a big problem. So it's a call towards a radical authenticity about our own experience. And that's not easy to do, because almost always our leveraging mind, our mind that wants to force something into a certain place, it's trying to find a secure ground underneath it rather than showing up with the full force of what's present in experience. But the second is transformational. The first might make change. You know, creating your spot from which you can lever the world, that might create change, but it won't transform anything. It'll push it around. Okay, so next week we will start taking up what Thich Nhat Hanh, a great teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, referred to as the dialectics of prajna, which is a kind of fun word. It's simply put, is something like the way he talks about it is a rose is not a rose, therefore it is a rose.